What's up everybody? Welcome back to my series on how to make amazing coffee. Today we're going to learn how to make the perfect cup of coffee at home for beginners. Let's do it. So in this series we're going to be learning how to improve your coffee game at home step by step. All the way from slightly improving your coffee to making a cup that you can charge $5 for at that hip coffee shop down the street that's decorated with Edison bulbs and reclaimed wood milk crates. I highly recommend you start the series from the beginning, which you can do by clicking right up here. However, if you are just going to watch this video, you'll be totally fine, so don't worry. So you got your great coffee, you're grinding your beans at home, we're just going to dump it into a Black & Decker coffee maker now, right? Wrong. I mean, look, you'd be way better off than before, but you came all this way, why not just brew it right? So the problem with those drip coffee makers is they don't properly saturate the grounds, and the water that they use doesn't get hot enough. So pretty much you've got damp grounds that are not coming into contact with hot enough water to extract all the good stuff from the coffee. So we're gonna learn how to brew great coffee today on a awesome entry-level manual coffee device, the French press. So anytime I see someone make coffee in a French press, ooh, I just cringe. My inner snob comes out and it's like nails on a chalkboard for me, because there's 4 really simple factors that you got to take into consideration when making a French press, and a lot of people don't even think about them. And if you I just shattered my French press. I'm going to go buy a new French press. Be right back. All right, so I'm here at the mall, about to buy a French press. Well, I found myself a French press, but it was 50 bucks and it's ridiculously tiny. But at least I got to see some cute dogs. All right, and we are back with my tiny, overpriced French press that I'm not bitter about at all. So where were we? I was gonna talk about how I'm a snob and I cringe every time I see someone making coffee in a French press. I guess my shattered French press was karma for my views. I'm like the comic book guy of coffee. So like I was saying, 4 factors people don't take into consideration when they're making their French press. So when you're brewing your coffee, you need to make sure that you're using the proper temperature for your water, that you're grinding the coffee to the correct size, that you are using the proper ratio of water to coffee, and making sure that you are steeping it for the correct amount of time. Now this doesn't just apply to French press, this applies to any coffee. Now as we are going through the brewing process, I'm going to teach you how to do each one of these correctly. Before we start, we're going to go through some gear that is super helpful when you're making French press, but completely optional. It's more used for other forms of brewing. So the first thing we have is our variable temperature electric gooseneck kettle, which is just a fancy way to say weird shaped kettle that heats up water to whatever temperature you tell it to. There's settings right here for setting the temperature. Really good because you can just set the proper temperature and forget it. The reason I use a gooseneck kettle is because this gooseneck, because it looks like a gooseneck, controls the flow of water. Important for other brewing methods, but not so much for French press, so feel free to use a measuring cup or whatever you can pour water out of in your house. So next up is your scale. This is going to tell you how much water and coffee you're using so you can brew in the proper ratio. If that's confusing, don't worry, we'll get to that in a second. Now a really handy conversion if you don't have a scale is that 1 gram of water equals 1 milliliter of water. 2 milliliters? No, 1 milliliter. So 1 for 1. There you go, that's a better representation, I think. Metrics are just amazing. All right, so it's time to get brewing. First thing we're gonna do is get some water and get that water to the correct temperature. But don't worry about how much water, just use at least maybe twice or 1.5 times as much water as you're gonna use to brew the coffee. Now this is the first problem I see when people are making French press. It's that they use boiling water, which is a horrible idea. You never want to use boiling water for coffee under any circumstances. Now temperature is gonna vary depending on the kind of coffee you're using and the roast level, but for the most part, just play around with it until you find the right temperature. The good general rule of thumb is that the darker the roast, the lower the temperature. A good range is about 185 degrees on the low end and 205 degrees on the high end. 185 being a dark roast and 205 being a very light roast. I'm using 185 for this particular roast because it's a pretty dark roast from a commercial roaster, and as I covered in my last video, they usually like to roast their coffee a little bit on the dark side. And in Bogota, Colombia, we're at like 8,000 feet, and at that altitude, water boils at a very low temperature, so I don't want to get the water boiling, which is really easy to do here. Is there any scientific backing behind this line of thinking? Absolutely not, but we're gonna go with it anyway like we're a flat earther. The coffee bean is flat, man. With all this talk about coffee, I should probably get my coffee. That would be a good idea. Okay, so it looks like we're at 185 degrees. Next thing we're gonna do is we are going to heat up our French press. We're gonna pour some water in there and preheat it. You don't want the temperature to immediately drop once you're brewing your coffee. There we go. And then while that's heating up, we're going to grind our coffee. Okay, so we're gonna move this over here, and now we're gonna weigh out our coffee. We're gonna use 20 grams of coffee, which is the usual amount that I make. If you want it a little bit weaker, use less coffee. That's another thing I see happening a lot, is that people think that the longer you steep your coffee, the stronger it's gonna be. Not the case, it's just gonna taste worse. All right, we're gonna set this to 0, and we're gonna weigh out 20 grams of coffee. And this is gonna be, I think, about 3 or 4 tablespoons. And you know, if you don't feel like getting a scale, you could totally use a tablespoon, but mind you that my tablespoon is probably gonna be a different size than your tablespoon, and it might not be the correct amount of coffee. So yeah, each tablespoon's about 5 grams. We got 11, we got 18, see that was 3. That was a little bit heavier, and we're gonna put a little bit more in there. 20 grams of coffee. All right, so next thing we're gonna do is grind our beans. Now, I didn't really think about the camera setup here, but that's fine. It's not a very exciting process. We're gonna put it in our little hopper over here. Make sure that it's clicked to the coarsest setting, and then we're gonna go ahead and grind. And there we go, we have our ground beans. We want the beans to kind of be like a little sandy, right? Like sand at a resort where you got a really good deal for a place that's right on the beach, then you step on the sand and you're like, oh, that's why it was a good deal, because this beach is kind of lame and doesn't have that really nice sand that you can kind of like, you know, put between your toes. You know what I'm talking about, like those white sand beaches. So you want to wait till your water is heated before you grind, because you want to grind at the last possible minute. I go into detail as to why in my last video, but you don't want all the good stuff to be released from your coffee in a nutshell. So you're going to take your water and dump it out, and put your coffee in this ridiculously small but way too expensive French press. If you have the choice, don't get a ridiculously small and overpriced French press. Set it back to 0 so it's zeroed out. And then you're gonna grab a chopstick or whatever you can to stir it. What we're gonna do first is we're going to bloom the coffee. Now, we have 20 grams of coffee in here. We're gonna put in 40 grams of water. And then we're gonna set the timer for 30 seconds. All right, so we got 40 grams of coffee. We're gonna stir it. Timer is going. I usually don't do this backwards, so yeah, this is a treat. And then you're gonna see there's gonna be some gases escaping. That's the carbon dioxide being cooked off from the coffee. We're gonna be using 280 grams of coffee because the coffee ratio, the water to coffee ratio you want is 1 part coffee to 13 to 15 parts water. You can use more or you could use less. I don't make the rules, I'm not your boss. And that's been going for way too long, so we're going to pour the rest in here. 280 total. So you're gonna get it all the way up there. I don't even know if this thing's gonna be able to handle all the water that I'm gonna need for this. Think this through. 280, all right, it did it. Exactly 1 cup of coffee, beautiful. What an innovation of modern design. Then we're gonna put this in here and then let it steep until the timer hits 4 minutes total. Now, the darker the roast, the tighter the ratio you want it to be. You want to use less water. The lighter the roast, the more water you want to use. The lighter roast is stronger, right? Because all the caffeine wasn't roasted away. So it's gonna be able to handle more water, and the lighter roast is weaker, so it's not going to be able to handle the amount of water that a light roast would. Also, I forgot, I was supposed to pour that hot water into my cup, because you want to pre-warm your cup because you don't want hot coffee to go into a cold cup. Now, something I didn't mention before, the reason that you want to do a really coarse grind with this coffee is because there's no filter between the coffee and the cup. So that coffee is coming in direct contact with the water and going straight into your cup. So if the grind is too fine, it's going to over extract and become bitter. The longer a coffee sits, the more the bitter, unpleasant compounds are gonna just be sucked out of that coffee. Now, just a note, during the bloom, if you don't see any gases being released, it means your coffee was roasted way too long ago and it's not fresh. All right, so we're exactly at 4 minutes. We're gonna take it off the scale because you don't want to apply unnecessary pressure. We're gonna throw away our water, throw it away, and then we're going to plunge And you should feel some resistance, but not too much resistance on that plunge. Now, if there's too much resistance, it's too fine. If there's no resistance, it's too coarse. But here we go. We've got a delicious cup of coffee. Perfectly brewed every time. It's way too hot. Oh, that's another thing I forgot to mention. Now you want to drink coffee once it's cooled down. You don't want scalding hot coffee because that heat is going to mask all the wonderful flavors in the coffee. There might be some chocolate, might be some berries in there. It can be the most amazing coffee in the world. If it's too hot, it's not going to be good. So this is the last thing that a lot of people mess up when they do French press, and it makes me just go, oh God, please don't. Oof. What they'll do is they'll brew it and just leave it in the French press as the serving device. All right, so my camera stopped recording at this point, but no big deal. What I was gonna say is that you shouldn't be using your French press as a serving device because the longer that coffee sits there, the more bitter it's gonna get. So essentially you just wanna serve your coffee immediately or put it into another container so it doesn't over extract. So how do you take your coffee? Cream, sugar, pig's blood? Hey, I'm not gonna judge. Different strokes for different folks. What kind of coffee do you use? Like what brand? Do you use Folgers? Do you use some super fancy coffee? What's your favorite brewing device? I'd love to know. Let me know in the comments section below. And until next time, this is the Hungry Gringo, signing off.